thank you though for helping making this happen. I'm very happy to be here tonight with y'all.
Yeah, man.
Awesome. We are so excited to have you. Let's see. I think just for you and maybe for others, if before we start, I'd like to kind of briefly share about how our group began and kind of why we were really interested and felt passionate about starting this series. At the beginning of the pandemic, my friends and fellow volunteers at the Bailey Boucher House, which is a AIDS hospice here in Seattle, introduced me to Dr. Max, who suggested we kind of start attending online lecture series. And we did, and it was really fun. We went through Dr. Evelyn Hammond's Epidemics in African American Communities. And so by listening to these speakers and kind of by doing our own reading, we began to learn more about the history of health disparities in the US, as well as the social and structural factors that are driving these inequities. And so as we began to kind of discuss these factors, we also began to read and discuss Martha Nussbaum's Poetic Justice, which focused on the relationship between the literary imagination and public life. And so while Nussbaum taught us that literature and the literary imagination can cultivate the reader's own public imagination, I began to wonder how literature might also enable physicians to project themselves into the lives of their patients in efforts to steer healthcare policy with both empathy and compassion. And this understanding, as well as the earlier media reporting on disparities and mistrust in the COVID pandemic, kind of led us to create a COVID and race reading group with a small group of pre-health students and young professionals, both from across the US and Canada. We're ranging from a senior in high school to a med student at UW. And so we initially started with both medical and sociological articles before we began moving on to more literary works. And so this fall, we've developed our speaker series in order to further develop our own medical and moral imagination. And we're so fortunate to be able to engage with several memoirists, community leaders, and historians. And so we hope that you guys enjoy the readings as much as we did, and feel free to engage with us as much as possible.
Thank you.
Do you want to introduce Kiese?
Yes, of course. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ashwin Pormataru. I'm a recent graduate from Seattle Pacific University. And tonight I have the task of introducing our guest speaker, and it's a great pleasure. He's an outstandingly accomplished writer, editor, and professor of English from Jackson, Mississippi. And his unique approach to intervening within critically important concepts of American racism, feminism, family, masculinity, and Southern Black life. In all of his work, he is a living inspiration to American youth. His best-selling memoir in 2018, Heavy, won the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction, the Christopher Isherwood Prize for Autobiographical Prose, the Austin Riggs Erickson Prize for Excellence in Mental Health Media, and was named one of the 50 best memoirs of the past 50 years by the New York Times. Like Toni Morrison, he emphasizes the influence of revision in writing, but as a path towards personal evolution. Throughout his memoir and his collection of short essays, his profound and compelling stories reveal his bold and authentic writing style that help readers on their own individual journey through introspection and self-discovery. Again, we welcome you all and thank you for taking the time off to join us here tonight. Please welcome Kiese Laymon.
Thank you so much for that. Wait, am I supposed to give a talk right now? Or are we? What are we?
Only Professor Laymon, only if you wanted to give you a little bit, few minutes, just if you wanted to add something on top of Ashwin's presentation introduction for you. But then we also wanted to start with a passage from your book Heavy, and then from there elaborate some questions for you.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm very thankful to be here with y'all, like seriously, and there are a lot of different angles I think people take into Heavy, and the angle that I've been most interested in exploring with other people is this health angle. I had a conversation 2 weeks ago with the faculty at Vanderbilt Medical School about the book, but also about interventions that they could make in their relationships with all of their patients. And I've been talking to a lot of different mental health people in the field too. So being able to talk to y'all for real tonight just makes me feel happy, particularly around issues of health in this time. I'm from Jackson, Mississippi. Michaela Robinson a little 8th grade girl from Raleigh, Mississippi, died yesterday of COVID. So it's never too late to talk about this, and we never can talk enough. So I'm very happy to be here with y'all.
Thank you for sharing that, and we're all sorry to hear about the girl that passed away because of COVID recently. If you would like, we wanted to read a page from Heavy, especially from the episode that you described of your grandmama's being in the hospital. And so page 269 for who has the book at hand. It says, Grandmama said she had faith in the white doctor who was taking care of her. She kept calling him the white man doctor, though he was really a short, light-complexioned black man with a dry red afro. The white man doctor got my best interest at heart, she said. Grandmama would be fine directly. The black doctor with the dry red afro asked me to leave the room because they had to do a small procedure. He said the infection was deeper than he thought. It started in the middle of her head and went down the back of her neck. We're gonna help her with this pain, he told me. The infection is seeping into her bloodstream. I walked out of the room, but I didn't close the door behind me. Lord Jesus, Grandma kept saying before she screamed. Please have mercy, please have mercy. I knew but didn't want to admit what Grandma was screaming. Why the black doctor with the dry red afro didn't give her enough anesthetic. Why he thought cutting a full inch and a half deep into the back of her scalp was for her own good. Folk always assumed black women would recover, but never really cared if black women recovered. I knew Grandmama would act like she recovered before thanking Jesus for keeping her alive. She would never publicly reckon with damage done to her inside and outside at the hands of people who claim to have her best interest at heart. She would just thank Jesus for getting through the other side of suffering. Thanking Jesus for getting us through situations we should have never been in was one of our family's superpowers. And from this passage in particular, I think most of us were really really wanted to highlight when you say on page 169, folk always assume black women would recover, but never really cared if black women recovered. Also because you mentioned when you describe your childhood experiences and when you witnessed episodes of sexual violence, how black women were expected to bend more than black men and other individuals in general, as if there were societal expectations for black women to be able to endure more pain than others.
Right.
And so how do you think that the societal expectation for black women being able to endure more pain are related to the experience that black women face in clinical settings? And if you think that there's how much there is of these expectations and also racial biases that enter the clinical setting from societal expectations, causing disparities such as, of course, black maternal mortality.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. That was amazing reading. I should have had you read the audio book, man. That was that was good. That was really, I mean, that was tough to hear the content, but you read that incredibly well. Yeah, I mean, I wish it was more complicated. In some way, what I was trying to, the subtext of that scene is yes, my grandmother was an older black woman, and in my experience, in this nation, the expectation is like black women somehow embody like this super women sort of stance, not from black women's POV, but often from people who are not black women. And I think on one hand, we can be like, oh, yes, we see black women as like magical and strong. But the problem in my experience is that, those women were assumed to be magical and strong, but very few people checked on them to see if they were strong. And when those black women did what people do, which is break under the weight of negligence, there weren't many people there to help. And so, I thought that was a very complicated scene. My grandmother kept calling the dude white, which in some way was like my trying to allude to my grandmother, who was, a very like proud black woman, but she also, sort of internalized a lot of anti-Blackness, as we all do, right? She wanted a white doctor, or she wanted a light complected doctor because she believed that a white doctor, a light complected Black doctor would be more skilled, right? Like, and this is the person I look up to, but she believed that. And that doctor did not give her enough local anesthetic and cut deeply into her head in a way that I don't think he would have done, not just if she weren't a Black woman, but if she were a Black woman, I think who he assumed was a moneyed Black woman, right? Who had some money. But again, I you know, my grandmother has fallen into diabetic comas since that. And what's interesting is like everybody, all of her kids and her grandkids, we all have, you know, we're either teachers or professors, you know, we all went to college. We all, most people have their masters. A lot of people have their PhDs. But when my grandmother went into a diabetic coma maybe 2 years ago, and then it was the first time white people had been in my grandmother's house, and then the white EMTs came, and every one of us like start, you know, when we heard they were coming, we all went and put on some clean clothes. We set up and we tried to talk the King's English, you know, like just to get my grandmother's blood sugar back to normal. You know what I mean? So I'm trying to do possibly too much in that scene, but I think at the root of it is this belief that medical professionals, people who are not medical professionals, I don't think we've done enough to think about what particular identities, what breaks particular identities, and why we believe that particular identities are stronger than others, and who suffers at that. You know, like that's what I'm trying to ask myself in that book, in that section particularly. Sorry to be so long-winded, but yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Oh, thank you, 100%. Also because we're aware that there are a lot of racial biases, especially also in the medical field, from both, unfortunately, some physicians and medical students when they're in training, such as Black individuals having a tougher skin, therefore they can feel less pain.
Right.
And if so, I guess your question was also to try and understand whether this comes from societal expectation, or if there's something at the structural level that is not working quite well. And what kind of conversations do you think that would benefit both medical students, current physicians, and aspiring physicians, in order to eliminate these biases?
Well, I mean, I think hard questions, hard, loving, tender questions have to be at the root of any sort of idea or ideal or institution we want to change. And, you know, when I was talking to people at Vanderbilt maybe 2 weeks ago, one of the things that one of the doctors just straight up sort of confessed was that if, you know, because they're overworked, and this is what I want to start with, you know, like in our you know, sadly, so many of our medical professionals are overworked. But the question still, I think we have to ask is, does it, like, you know, if I'm overworked and there's some wealthy person over here, let's say who happens to be white, and there's some poor person over here, you know, who happens to, let's say, who happens to be Black, like what the Vanderbilt doctors told me explicitly, and I was shocked, was that often they say implicitly they're going to make sure that that white person has better care because they're afraid of what would happen if they don't give that white person better care, as opposed to not just that this Black person, you know, has a super body and is immune to pain and all of that, but also like the failure is going to be magnified, and the consequence of that failure, they said, was going to be felt more by a rich, wealthy person, as opposed to, like, you know, I'm just saying, like a poor and or Black and poor woman. And so I think conversations need to be had about what we bring to our professions. And as a professor, I think I need to have these really hard questions too. And definitely medical professionals need to. I don't know if those conversations are happening, but if medical professionals are like any of the rest of us, sometimes I think we might pat ourselves on the back for beginning those conversations, when those conversations are what need to be part and parcel of every single day of our lives, right? This isn't some kind of work you can just be like, oh, I did that, check it on the box, because we bring too much devastating inequity, imaginative inequity, to every setting. So in those settings, when sometimes people's lives are on the lines, I just hope that there's some way that we can make systematic the pushing and the questioning of what we bring into these professional settings.
Thank you for sharing your perspective, Professor
Thank
Laymon.
you.
I have a question next. So my reaction to heavy makes me think about conversations I've had with my father about the Freudian analysis of the uncanny and when the arts are used to make the familiar unfamiliar and vice versa. And this unsettling effect of the uncanny is really recognizable in films like Blue Velvet or Get Out. And Heavy is an American memoir, a genre that Black males have drawn on to provide a linear and coherent narrative to describe social mobility, respectability, and accomplishment. And although your narrative moved me towards a coherent understanding of your story, it seemed implicitly and explicitly disruptive. And one of the things that's challenging is that within certain narratives in the Black community is the nurturing relationships between either a child and their mother or a child and their grandmother. And potentially one of the most moving vignettes in the book that I noticed is when you wrote a note to your grandmother trying to share your traumatic experiences with her. And if you have your book, it's specifically on page 59, where you wrote, later that evening, I wrote, I know you want me to write about the book of Psalms. If it is okay, I just want to tell you about some secrets that be making my head hurt. I be eating too much and staying awake at night and fighting people in Jackson. Mama does not like how my eyes are red. I wake her up in the morning and she be making me use this sign before school. I try, but I can't tell her what's wrong. Can I tell you? Can you help me with my words? The words Mama make me use don't work like they're supposed to work. And this particular passage really stuck with me. And one of the initial questions that came to mind when I read that passage was whether you had wished your grandmother had intervened in that moment. And also, however, I also found this connection to pediatrics and thinking about how primary care physicians think about the role of the guardian and also their own role in making sure that children are safe. And my own father has been quite candid about being raised by a single mother who was trying to keep a roof over their heads. And in that particular context, sometimes children are really vulnerable to conscious predatory people and also people who, because of circumstances, act in predatory ways towards children. So, with all that being said, there's an aspect that needs to be preventative, but there's another aspect that should be concerned with excavating the trauma, allowing the patient to share the trauma after the fact, and doctors helping with their trauma. So, how might physicians advocate for children in similar circumstances, and what might we do to help families? And how might we prevent peer-to-peer sexual abuse among children? And finally, how might the uncanny inform medical education?
Oh my goodness. That's a great question for someone's graduate thesis. So I'm gonna try to do the best I can with it. But that literally is like, I mean, that's phenomenal. Yeah, you know that passage in the book is sort of like the root of heavy. Like that note that I wrote. I wrote that verbatim in this notebook that my grandmother called my Sunday school notebook. And when I was going back to collect all my material and research for heavy, you know, I found all these notebooks and that was written. And yeah, like I was writing that because I had seen some sex. I was a bystander with two of my friends being sexually assaulted. I had been molested by one of my mother's students who was supposed to be babysitting me. And my grandmother at that point was someone who I saw, for all intents and purposes, as a god. And I did not know how to talk to God about what I was experiencing. So I thought, let me write it down. That's what I think I was experiencing. You know, it's all retrospective. And the thing about it was the first time in my life I'd asked my grandmama for help. And my grandmother was just like, pretty much, she was telling me, I can't do anything for you. And I understood later that she couldn't do anything about my experiences with sexual violence because she had her own experiences with sexual violence that she had not attended to either. So it was like, you know, I was asking her to jump into this deep end pool to help me. I'm drowning. And my grandmama saying, well, she's not saying, but my grandmother, I understood to be saying is like, Kiese, I have like all of these like weights on my back. If I jump in, I'm going to drown with you. And I'm afraid to let you see that I can't swim. So one of the things I think physicians can do is actually like, you know, this is going to sound sort of self-serving, but I think literature, not just nonfiction, but I think literature whether it's The Color Purple, you know, Corregidor, that actually like explores a lot of what we're talking about here, is so important for those of us who write literature. But I think it might be as important as, or more important, for medical professionals to see and explore the ways other creatives have actually like mined the imaginary. Because I don't know what it means. I don't know what it's like to be a doctor. I don't know what it's like to go to med school. But I assume that the imaginary, right, and what we bring to the imaginary, and what we bring to our imaginations as we walk in people's bodies with scalpels, if we talk to people's families, I think the imagination is what dictates the ideas, and the ideas are what dictates the rupture. And I think a lot of times in my own experience, I can only say this, like I've had doctors who talk to me. I've rarely had a doctor not talk down to me. And it's not because I didn't understand the words and the phraseology. I just think sometimes that the people who need to be the best at talking and listening, maybe because of overwork, but also because of their education, are not good at listening at all. So one of the things I would just suggest is like this notion of like radical listening. But it's hard to radically listen to people who come from different sensibilities and places if you've never even imagined or read people from different sensibilities or places. So what I'm trying to say is like, I think literature is something that is crucial to, I wish literature were crucial to all medical professionals. And then the question is like, what kinds of literature and whatnot. But I'll just say, I would like to believe that there's more hands-on stuff that can be done in that way. I want to make sure I get to parts of all of that question, but literally that question I could talk about that question for like 6 hours tonight. It's just there's so many layers to it. I think the other part, if we're talking about heavy though, is, you know, I'm gonna try to flip this a bit, like resentment. Like I resented my grandmother for not helping me, you know, because what I was saying to my grandmother, and for the other part is like, I was saying, you know, that person who you had, your daughter, my mother, you know, she's going through it. She's getting beaten by her boyfriend. She's working. She doesn't know how to ask for help, but she's also doing things to my body that are not fair. Right. And I know I'm putting you in a tough position, grandmama, but I'm asking you, can you help me? And not help me by disciplining my mama, but like, can you intervene? And so my own grandmother couldn't intervene when she knew my mother was abusing me. So I'm just gonna have to be honest and say, I don't know what medical professionals can do if they suspect abuse. But what I will say is, I think there are a lot of different ways to abuse children. And I think sometimes we tend to focus on the ways that like Black and or brown people like are perceived as abusing people physically. But those of us who have been abused physically, emotionally, psychologically know that there are tons of ways. And I just think, like, I don't know how doctors can be better at listening and protecting children if they think they are being abused. But I would hope that doctors would check themselves if they get to this point where they believe that most of the children, or a large number of children who are being abused by Black or brown parents. That may or might not be true, but I think everything about the way we've been educated has taught us that like abuse manifests solely in physical ways. And I just don't think that's true. So I'm just trying to say, I think we need to, yes, find creative ways to intervene, but that intervention has to be ethical. And I don't know how that intervention can be ethical unless we go back and rethink all of the ways we've been educated, which have ways I've been educated have encouraged me to believe that Black and brown children are more likely to be abused. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm sure numbers would say something, but I want to push back on everything I bring to every interaction with people as a professor. And again, I would hope the doctors and medical professionals would do the same. That's a very bad answer to that like incredible question, but it's just too layered and too good of a question. So that's all I got right now. So thank you.
No, that was great. Thank you so much.
Hi, Kiese. Happy birthday. Thanks for coming out tonight. I just had a question, like in the scene of where the grandmother was getting the treatment and she was going through so much pain. I just thought about the medical mistrust aspect of that scene. Like when you said she kept calling him the white man doctor, though he was really short, light complexion Black man with the dry red afro. It's like, even though he was Black, she still saw medicine as a white institution.
Yes.
Like, I think that was like really interesting to me. Like, even though medical schools say more diversity, more this, it's like she didn't feel like she could get the care that she really needed. And like, as you know, future healthcare providers, hopefully like what kinds of things should doctors do to like confront these issues that's like in the back of the minds of.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is the question, because, you know, if we lived in this world where anti-Blackness was just something people born white have to reckon with, and or misogyny was something, you know, purely people who are raised or, you know, identify as men had to deal with, it'd be a lot easier to deal with all of this stuff. But the fact is, anti-Blackness manifests in humans, right? Just like queer antagonism, just like misogyny, in different ways. I'm not saying they all do the same kind of work, but they're all these like systems that we all have invested in to different degrees. I do think, you know, I think identity sometimes can dictate like the ways we invest, but there's no doubt that we all invest in it. And so that's what I was trying to allude to in that scene, which is like, on one hand, you know, my mother and my aunts were like, we got a Black doctor, yes. On the other hand, we had a Black doctor that treated my grandmother in ways that she should not have been treated, right? Retrospectively, like there's a longer story that my parents, my mother and her sisters eventually did intervene in that situation a few days later, because they realized that, like, you know, there was pain, there was something that should have happened that did not happen. But I think what gives us an opportunity to actually convene and use education as a tool to push ourselves is realizing that we all invest to different degrees in these things that are like at the root terrifying and terror. If we understand that, then I think we can break down this idea of like, oh, we need to be defensive, we need to blah, blah, blah. The question is like, how do we invest, and what are the consequences of that investment? And again, I can't speak as a medical professional because I'm not, but in my own field, as a writer, as a Black writer, it is lucrative to invest in anti-Blackness. It is lucrative for me to like deploy like all of these archetypes and all these stereotypes, and or to fetishize blah, 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 and titillate white people and not really push anything. That's very lucrative. Like I can make money doing that. And so what I'm saying is like, I think we all have to do the hard work. And I think it needs to be done individually and also in like sustained collectives to ask ourselves how our investments in blank impact our ability to do a job. And if we're talking about medical professionals, the job often is to help people be healthy and or sometimes keep people alive. So I just think the incentive to do this work is even like greater for medical professionals, police officers, and teachers. I think those people, my grandmother always says, like, those are the people in the world who can't fuck up, excuse me. Like, and when we do, those are the people in the world who have every incentive in the world, or should have every incentive in the world, to be honest about the ways that we've messed up so we can revise that going forward. And that's all I can say. Like, I am a Black man from Mississippi, and I too invest in anti-Blackness. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm a big Black man from Mississippi, and I too invest in anti-fatness. So if I'm invested in that, I just think other people who are not also are. And then the question is like, what do we do with that? And to whom are we harming when we don't actually interrogate our investment? So thank you for that.
I think that's also a really good point to kind of bring home. It's like, I think what I've learned, especially over the past year, is just constantly thinking about what does it historically mean, you know, to treat someone who does not look like you. And something that you also kind of touched on that I've been thinking a lot of recently is you kind of touched on ascriptive identity a bit. And I know that some of us are working on our secondary med school applications right now. And for a lot of these applications, we're being asked to define community, but it seems like in more narrow terms, and with the expectation that we kind of identify based on geographical or racial or ethnic identity. But something that really stood out for me when you talk about your time volunteering at Grace House is that community can be defined also by one's affiliation or affinity to certain groups. I was just kind of wondering how you kind of articulate your own notion of community as well as identity in the ways that you found yourself participating in these.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a great question, right? Because community is just one of these words that particularly in collegiate settings, like we just
Right.
use, right? We just throw it out. And it's a virtuous word, right? We're supposed to believe that when you say community, just like when you say family, there's supposed to be some implicit like bond. But those of us who are from like contiguous families know when you say family, a lot of us are like, oh, you know. And I think similarly, community, I think is a very, very scary word. And so what do we want it to mean versus what does it mean is the question that I'm always kind of contending with. And so like I'm a writer. Often I do the same thing. I'm trying to critique, right? Like if I find groups of people who I vibe with, I'll be, some people like, that's my tribe. I'll be like, man, I got a new community. And really what I'm saying is there are these new groups of people who do what I do, who make me feel good.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know if that's community, but what I want to do is make space for that community that is ruptured in and of itself, ruptured, and does everything possible to hide the cracks, to hide the rupture, because that's most communities. And I actually know most communities I'm a part of are actually like ruptured communities with people who put on masks to get through the day. And we rarely want to look back if we made a mistake, and we always want to point fingers at somebody else. Like that too is a community. And so I just like everything. I'm not sure how much work can be done if we're talking about rhetoric, if we just sort of like haphazardly like just deploy words that are like just virtue signals, like community, when we all know that most communities, regardless of wealth, regardless of class, regardless of everything, are like wholly terrifying and fucked. Like that's just true. And I don't say anything is true, but that I know that to be true. So if we start from there and we ask ourselves like about utopia, like what do we want from our communities, and what kind of work will it take for us to get to this point, and what kind of work will it take to sustain? I just think like those quote unquote communities are going to necessarily change, like the shift. Like if those are the questions that undergird community, the community, quote unquote, is going to have to shift, because you're asking every member of that community to take responsibility for the failures of the community. And you're also asking every member of that community to find, this is just as important as the failures, some joy, some sort of joyful manifestation that we might not articulate. Community, love, family, those are very dangerous words, y'all. I'm a writer, but I think they're very dangerous words for all of us who think we're doing some sort of collective good. Because often they're like proxies for who we want to be, but they completely neglect who we are. And I just think if we go forward with that notion, I just think the quote unquote community is not just going to be stronger or bigger or blah, blah, but it's going to define itself in words that you and I haven't even created yet. But you can't do that if you think you're delivered just because you're part of a community,
Yeah. No, that makes sense. What you're kind of talking about reminds me of Gert Biesta in Beyond Learning, where he kind of talks about this idea of strangeness, and how in order to like build these stronger communities, you have to overcome this strangeness in order to promote this like pluralism and tolerance. So I think that was important. Thank you.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting that, I mean, I could say everything I just said.
Yeah.
And I want to be like, when I get off this phone, phone. Woo, I'm an old head. When I get off this computer, I'm just gonna be like, I got a new community now. I'm with a new community. You know what I mean? Like we all want to invest in this notion of like innocence, right? Like it's like a shield of innocence because we're a community. But yeah, that question and that statement is just making me realize how important it is to always pause and stop, to really ask ourselves what ingredients are in that community and what ingredients do we want to believe are parts of our community. I think the same thing about in relationships in general, actually. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to ask a question. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
After reading your memoir, I wanted to ask about the mental process you went through in response to comments from loved ones and conversations surrounding your weight. When you were young and binge eating, your grandmother and other older churchwomen called, as you quote, fatness fine, and Zola told you that she felt safer when you were heavier. And later on, after your weight loss, your uncle commented that you look great, Key. I'm really proud of how you're taking care of yourself, even though you had a poor relationship with food. Can you talk about how you felt in those moments and how others' comments and opinions, especially from loved ones, impacted your perception of yourself and inner
Ooh.
battles with health and weight?
Yeah, I can talk about that. But it's hard. You know, I think there are a lot of examples of this, but for me, weight was one of the only things I can point to where almost everyone in my family, everyone that I interact with in my family, everyone I interacted with outside of my family, my students, my colleagues, almost everyone who purported to have some sort of like for me congratulated me when I was most unhealthy because I looked most normal, right? Like, I mean, I don't know if normal, I mean, it's their norm, right? It wasn't normal. Like when I had 2% body fat and I'm running a gazillion miles a day, you know, people acted like they liked me more. And I'm a human being. So like, you know, like that is contagious sometimes. So, you know, if I lose this weight, wow, this person here is gonna look at me and smile instead of looking at me and looking disgusted. Well, shit, I'm gonna lose more weight. You know, if I'm gonna walk into my grandmother's house and my grandmother, my mom, and everybody, oh, Key, you look so good, as opposed to, damn, Key, did you eat a house? You know, I'm gonna do that other thing. So, but I'm part of that too. You know, like I often, before I wrote Heavy, would congratulate people for losing weight without any clue of what it took. You know, without any clue of whether or not I was congratulating them or for something that was actually healthy. But I think we have to say that. I think we have to say that there's a part I need to say. I'm not going to put this on y'all. I need to say there was a part of me that wanted people to congratulate me for my disordered eating. I wanted people to be like, "Damn, you look good," for my like exercise um, obsession, for my body dysmorphia. So I'm not blaming anyone for that, but I do think we live in a culture sometimes where people we love and people we don't love can encourage us to do things that parts of us might think are healthy, but are just wholly unhealthy. And, you know, I'm gonna tell you this, you didn't ask this, but I think sometimes when people think you write a book, uh, that the journey is over. And I've never said this before, but you know, Heavy came out October 2018, and when I went to my grandmama's house that Christmas for, you know, I was like, man, my family's gonna be like, you got this book, it was a bestseller. It only been out like 2 months, but it had done really well, won some awards, won a Carnegie, blah blah blah. And it's so weird. Like I thought that the book was gonna shield me from those critiques of my body. And when I walked in the house, like nobody was talking about my book. People were just like whispering, you know, damn, Key fat. Or my grandmama literally was like, did you eat 2 houses? You know what I'm saying? And like that shit hurt me so much. And it hurt me because I'd somehow fixed my mind to believe that like because I wrote a book that the rest of the world lauded, that my family wouldn't see me as disgusting or gross because I was bigger than they thought I should be. And it wasn't. And that shit hurt, you know? And if we're talking about health and mental health, you know, the craziest thing about like book journeys, like any other journey, you know, I think one of the things I won was just like Austin Riggs thing for mental health. And the illest thing about that was like when Heavy came out, it was a mind fuck for me. Excuse that language, but like I was all over the place. You know, I go out on tour, people be touching my body. I was like, what does it mean that I've given people I don't know so much of myself? And like I was in a bad place mentally. And I was like, but because I've written this book, I've become much more like renowned or known, I didn't know who to talk to about it. So I'm looking for places to check myself into just because I needed some help. And then I get a letter from those same people that I was about to check myself in telling me they're giving me this mental health award. So I'm like, oh shit, I guess I can't check myself into this place because they think I got it all together, the Austin Riggs mental health people. So it's just so odd to me sometimes. I think not what you all bring, but sometimes what I bring to like product. This question wasn't about this, but like in my own mind, I thought, yo, I finished this book. all of these like holes and, you know, gaping holes in my psyche and my body are going to be healed. And I think I did a lot of familial healing, but there are a lot of things that I did not heal. And the book made it harder for me to ask for help because I thought the book was supposed to symbolize that I'd already gotten there. You know, so your question makes me go into a different place, but I just was saying all that to say that I think sometimes what we need to do is also remind ourselves that the people who appear to have done the work need lots of help as well. Do you know? That's what your question makes me think about. So thank you.
Hearing that question, it kind of made me think about, for me, one of the biggest takeaways was the ways that I kind of had pictured physicians kind of like not really treating the patient's true source of hunger, you know, not addressing that emotional aspect, really what they were going through, and just more like telling patients to exercise more and eat healthier, which I mean, alone is often not, you know, it's not going to really treat anything. So I think that just really stood out to me, this whole idea of incorporating this trauma-informed care into weight management.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just, I did a talk 2 days ago with this writer, Deshaun Harrison, and the book is called Belly of the Beast. Y'all should check that out. I mean, it is going right to everything you're talking about. And one of the things that Deshaun wrote in the book was that, yes, we need to talk about the ways, like, you know, smaller bodies might live longer, be healthier, and have, but Deshaun was like, we don't know what happens if bigger people actually get like the care that they're supposed to get. Like, we can't even talk about if like bigger people or smaller people, like, you know, the disparities and like, you know, life expectancy and blah blah blah, because what we do know is that bigger people don't get the health care that they, you know, comparatively. I never even imagined that. I didn't know that, right? So I'm also saying that I'm learning a lot from not just y'all, but from people who have done this work. You know, I'm a writer, I'm a thinker, I try to work through all this kind of stuff. But like, that blew my mind, because I think I carry with me this idea that like, if you're a bigger person, you're necessarily like, you're not healthy. You're less healthy than a skinnier person. And that could or could not be true. But Deshaun was just like, yeah, but let's look at, do you think bigger people get treated as fairly or as thoroughly in these doctors' offices? And I think you need to look at like class, race, and all that other kind of stuff. But you know, Deshaun's research was like, no. So Deshaun was like, well, we can't talk about this idea of like who's healthier until we talk about equity in those doctors' offices. And I just never had imagined that.
Yeah, Caroline.
I raised my virtual hand too. Thank you so much for talking to us. This is really, really interesting. And, you know, what you said made me think about like how internalized fat phobia and internalized racism causes a lot of, you know, direct harm onto patients. You know, like you said, like you mentioned, and I read a study recently about how, you know, fat people aren't dying more from COVID because of like their inherent like physiological like unhealthiness. They're dying because doctors aren't treating them early enough, whereas they would treat a thinner, smaller bodied patient at an earlier time and intervene earlier. And that's why fat people are dying from COVID at higher rates. And so this like internalized fat phobia, you know, is directly harming patients, and internalized racism is directly harming patients in that, you know, Black patients like your grandma don't get the correct care. But I was wondering what you think about like internalized fat phobia and racism, and like how those things affect like structural healthcare, and how, you know, like how can structures be changed if people don't address their internalized, you know, fat phobia and racism.
Yeah. And I'm just gonna harken back to this conversation I had a few days ago about Belly of the Beast. That's a great question. I mean, you know, one of the things that Deshaun Harrison just says plainly is that, you know, if you do not long to have relationships, not Deshaun is not saying just romantic, or not saying it's just sexual, but romantic, sexual, interpersonal, blah blah blah, with fat people. Deshaun Harrison writes that you are not just there's not just fat phobia, like you are anti-fat, and that was useful for me because, again, as I talked about structures before, that we tend to invest in, and like when you invest in something, you make it bigger and stronger, and yeah, and so like I have invested deeply, even as a big person, as a fat person, like I have invested deeply in a kind of anti-fatness in my, not just in my daily lived life. And this was so important about the book, because we start talking about structures. The really hard thing is, if we want to get at structures, we have to get at ideas. And to get at ideas, we often have to get at utopias and fantasies. And in my fantasies, like I'm not just talking about intimate fantasies, like I am rarely like the person I am. In my fantasy, whenever I think about Kiese, I'm always the person I was, 10 years ago, right? I'm that person who was without the fainting and with all of that. But I imagine myself walking around a particular kind of way. I imagine myself talking, and I see this picture of myself. I'm like, oh shit, who is that? Oh, that's me. But when I was that skinny person, I imagined myself like, like a really huge person. And so this might sound like I'm trying to run away from your question, but again, I'm not. Like, as a writer and as someone who believes that, life of the mind means we have to deal with the life of the ideas, which also means we have to deal with the life of the fantasy of our ideas. I just think we have to ask those hard questions about, like, who are we in our fantasies? Like, are we in our fantasies? Like, what kind of people are we interacting with in our fantasies? Are there fat people in our fantasies? Yes or no? And if not, let's talk about it. And if yes, let's talk about that. I don't think we can get at the structures until we talk about the fantasy, because I think structures have their own fantasies, and structures fantasies often make the most vulnerable people suffer. I think all of us suffer in these like unchecked structures, actually, but I don't think you can get there unless you actually like individually do the work of thinking through like what a fantastical version of yourself or your friends looks like. And if there are no fat people in there, I'm going to believe that you're probably not doing right by fat people professionally.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. Did anyone else have any other questions they really wanted to ask?
Well, I'm not supposed to be asking questions, huh?
Okay. We'll make an exception if you.
And I intentionally didn't try to formulate a question or come up with a question because to like be in the background, and but that didn't seem right either. But recently over this weekend, as I've been thinking about the book and thinking about the questions and thinking about the genre of the memoir, as I've been talking to my daughters about, in this sense of the uncanny, and you touched on it because you said, usually, like when what's her name, when Stella got her groove back, the idea is that she got her groove back, right? It's like she got everything together, but the irony or the wonderful, beautiful, and scary and terrifying thing about your memoir is that you uncover these things and it isn't about moving towards the fantasy and fulfilling it. It's about exposing it without exposing it. And as I've been thinking about it, I was thinking, I don't know, I just want to, it's like I wanted to ask you, how did you, the other book that I'm thinking about is American Hunger. And like you could call this American Hunger. Because yours is heavy American memoir, but it's the heaviness is a consequence of a hunger, right?
Yeah.
I remember, so I had a student, because I work with these pre-meds, and she had written this offensive personal statement about her experience at the dialysis clinic, and about a Black patient who wouldn't show up when she was supposed to. When she showed up, she would show up with McDonald's. And in this particular story, she showed up with a whole pie. You could buy, like a cherry pie or apple pie at QFC or grocery stores here. and she implicitly was chastising the patient in this narrative. And I, I was trying to persuade her that it wasn't going to go over well. But I asked her, because I think the personal statement is an instrument of reflection, to think about what that pie meant to this elderly Black woman.
Mm-hmm.
Why would she not show up? What could be issues beyond transportation that kept her from showing up to the clinic? And why was she showing up to the clinic with food?
Right.
Food that she's not supposed to be eating. And what did she think, in our culture, pie means? What might pie mean to a Black person?
Yes.
And so, where I went with that, the pie, because often, like what Mike was, sometimes you have these elderly patients, they don't have family, but pie might remind you of grandma.
Yep.
Grandma's house. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So, I don't know where I'm going with this, but part of it is in thinking about all the things that you brought up and churned up and the others have churned up, because we don't have to resolve everything, I think there's a relationship between structural oppression and, of course, conspicuous consumption, but then the way we try to medicate, right? The way we try to find love, or, what you were expecting when you walked in your house.
Right.
Right. And so, I could imagine myself on the way home buying a pint of ice cream or picking up a lemon meringue pie. Do you have any thoughts about that? And how...
I do. Family, that is an amazing story, first of all, because yes, I mean, so much. I mean, that book is rooted in the uncanny. I'm literally trying to dangle deliverance every 2 chapters to the reader and then circumvent it. I mean, I do it most explicitly with that last chapter where I say my mother and I walk out of the casino hand in hand, and then the epilogue starts and I'm turning right back around. But I think the same can be said for that story, because on one hand, okay, yeah, like don't bring a pie when you're at dialysis. That pie might be part of the reason you might be on. That's one way to look at it. But because of the way I'm thinking that is courageous as hell to bring something that makes you feel good in home to a place that doesn't make you feel good in home, right? And I think there's a way to think about that. And it doesn't mean that reading has to necessarily like trump the other reading. But what we don't do is we don't allow, because we're not taught to allow this, we don't allow these like, seemingly like warring ideas of what this woman is doing to occupy the same space or the same body. And I think that like who benefits from that? I have an idea, but also know who the fuck doesn't benefit from that. And that's that woman eating that pie. And I just think that there are ways to go into situations like that. One is to talk and listen. It goes back to what we said earlier. But 2 is like, we have to, I think we're all encouraged to like come to these like resolute endings. Like we want deliverance, right? Like Heavy is being made into a film right now. Hollywood is trying its damnedest to make that movie end with my mama and I walking out of the building, out of the casino, hand in hand, happy-go-lucky. We've solved all our problems. Like that's the ending. Like the people who paid me money for my book, that's the ending that they want. And I'm just like, that's not my book. If you can do that shit if you want to, but like understand that my book is actually saying this notion of a happy ending has to be not just poked and prodded, but wrestled with. Because I want workable endings. I want liberatory endings. And liberatory workable endings mean like, to me, aren't endings at all. Like, you get lost in the process. But I think sometimes it's hard to get lost in the process when deliverance is what's being sold to us in commercials and education and religion and relationships. And I just think for the work that y'all are doing, we just need people to go beyond that. We need you to be great at what y'all do, as doctors, but we also need you to just remind yourself that there's a real live human being with complicated thoughts, feelings, and ideas and fantasies about who you all are as physicians on the other ends of this phone call, of the scalpel, of the diagnosis, of the prescription. And if you can believe that and understand that all the time while being overworked, I think that those vulnerable people are going to have a better shot than if you did not. And that's all I can say as someone who doesn't know the language, doesn't know anything about medicine, but knows a lot about how it feels to be treated like a fat nigga in hospitals, because that's what I've been treated like most of my life. So that's what I got, y'all. Y'all pushed me hard tonight. I'm thankful. I'm very thankful.
Thank you, King. It's been beautiful. It's been beautiful watching you interact with the young people. You've been gracious, especially on your birthday. You've been brilliant. I've been watching Arthur Jaffa on binge watching him, and I'm like, what the fuck is going on in Mississippi?
And that dude he's of Earth, but he's of some other constellation, fam. He's different. His
But
mind is different, brother.
you, Bradley, I mean, there's so many of you all. I mean, what's in the water? But I'm
Poison. Shit, you know what's in the water down here.
man, but I'm really grateful. Really grateful. I'll let Macy close since she's the architect of all of this.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
I'd like
Max.
to add something, if I may.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I actually come from like an Indian family, and so we have very strict family dynamics and like the social ranking of parents and kids and all these things, looking up to our parents and pleasing our parents. And growing up in this kind of, you know, dynamic, it's not very obvious to see like when there's like the line or the boundary that's crossed. And having to read your book, it like really made me reflect on a lot of things that happened in my life and like my childhood. And I just want to say it's like really commendable, and I really love reading your book.
Thank you.
Yeah, I feel like I found a lot of similarities with my family too. And it really makes me want to like make sure that before I go into, you know, pre-health and medical school, that I know where I stand so I can better, help other people. So
absolutely. That's the hope. I mean, I know we're all from different places and differences, but if you have parents, I just think like and if you have children, I think like this is work, like and in our households, like the hardest part of heavy was like I'm not supposed to talk about any of that, like what I mean, like you don't talk about anything that is not that doesn't make you and your family look great. Right. And I broke that rule 15 million times in that book, and my point is I'm glad that you can see some utility in the breaking of that rule. So thank you.
All right.
Well, thank you again, Kiese. This has been such an honor to have you here, and we are so grateful that you came in.
I'm really thankful. Thank y'all for helping me in my birthday on happier than it would have been. And thank you for pushing me. And hopefully you can, if I write something, you can see a lot of your ideas that you've pushed me to think about in it. So thank y'all. Thank y'all for giving me much more than I deserve tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.